Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I evaluate the Green New Deal, which has just been released by the Democrats. So what is the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal is a 10-year plan introduced by Representative Cortez and Senator Markey to mobilize every aspect of American society towards 100% clean and renewable energy, guarantee a good job to all members of our society, and create economic prosperity for all. Well, that sounds amazing. Who could possibly be against something like that? That'd be just like Venezuela. Socialism for everyone. The goals of the Green New Deal are to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers. Wow, in 10 years we'll eliminate our fossil fuel usage and create justice for everyone. All the government will need to do will be confiscate everybody's cars, then we'll have justice and equity. And we'll end oppression of indigenous peoples, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth. And as an added bonus, they're going to put an end to extreme weather and stop sea level rise. Nearly 100 Democratic members of Congress in the House and Senate have signed on to this deal. It must be awesome. That's almost like a consensus of Democratic Congress people. And the Washington Post agrees. Cortez says the world will end in 12 years. She's absolutely right. And the New York Times agrees too. Panic may seem counterproductive, but in the case of climate change, we're at a point where alarmism and catastrophic thinking are valuable. So Democrats and the press seem to be completely on board with the idea that the government needs to come confiscate your car or we're all going to drown. Over the last 20,000 years, sea level has risen about 130 meters or 400 feet. These red lines point to natural sea level rise. The blue line points to what Democrats believe is man-made sea level rise, this little tiny bit at the end. So by confiscating your car, the Democrats are going to put an end to this 20,000 years of sea level rise. This is a graph of carbon dioxide versus year going back to the 1830s. You can see that it's been rising since then, and it's accelerated quite a bit since the 1950s. The Democrats believe that if we could reduce atmospheric CO2 levels down to say 300 parts per million, we could put an end to extreme weather. Well, we don't need climate models to test this theory out because we have plenty of historical evidence from what the climate was actually like back when CO2 was 300 parts per million. Let's go back and see what the climate was like, say, back in 1925. In 1925, CO2 levels were very low in the atmosphere, and the deadliest tornado in U.S. history hit. The tornado struck at least 3 states in the Midwest, killed around 1,000 people, and leveled dozens of towns. There were about 4,000 casualties from that 1925 tornado, back when atmospheric CO2 was very low. Now compare that to 2018 with atmospheric CO2 over 410 parts per million. Last year was the first year on record in the United States with no EF4 or EF5 tornadoes. Which means that last year, which had the highest CO2 levels, also had the fewest violent tornadoes of any year on record. But perhaps if we went back to 300 parts per million CO2 like in 1925, we could get giant tornadoes like this again. That doesn't really sound like social justice to me. Now let's look at some more things which were going on in the 13 years after 1925. In 1926, Miami was destroyed by a hurricane. In inflation-adjusted dollars, it was the most expensive catastrophe in U.S. history. Well, perhaps if we drop CO2 levels back to 300 parts per million, we could get Miami destroyed again by another huge hurricane. The next year, 1927, brought the worst floods in U.S. history. The Mississippi River was flooded for more than 6 months along a length of several hundred miles. The flood was so bad that it forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee their homes, who generally moved up to northern cities. Most of the people affected were the descendants of slaves who had homesteaded along the Mississippi River after the Civil War. Well, that doesn't sound like social justice either. Hundreds of thousands of black people, descendants of slaves, losing their homes in a low CO2 environment. The Red Cross ranked 1927 as the worst disaster year on record. They reported 111 disasters, including 29 tornadoes, 24 floods, 23 fires, 4 earthquakes, and 9 hurricanes. Much of St. Louis was destroyed by a tornado in late September 1927. November of 1927 brought the worst floods in Vermont's history along the Winooski River. More than 1,000 bridges were wiped out, and the lieutenant governor drowned in that flood. I lived in Winooski for a while, and I could see the high water mark. It was pretty incredible. The summer and fall of 1927 also brought many great heat waves. In fact, on October 2nd, 1927, it was 99 degrees in New York State. I wonder why Representative Cortez doesn't remember that. And they had some very warm weather in the Arctic that year. This was a child sunbathing near the North Pole. You can see by the big smile on his face how bad warm weather is for children. A year later, in 1928, was one of the deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history. It struck Florida and killed more than 1,000 people. And at the same time the hurricane hit Florida, there were vast forest fires burning in California. It isn't clear to me why the Democrats want to go back to these low CO2 years, which were full of natural disasters. But let's continue looking at the history. 1931 brought the worst floods on record to China. The flood killed more than 3 million people. The flood affected an area 1,000 miles long and 50 miles wide, an incredibly large area, and it left 30 million people hungry. This low CO2 social justice isn't necessarily looking like such a good thing. Now let's go to 1934, which was the hottest year on record in the United States before NASA started tampering with the data. You can see this animation flashing between their 1999 version of the U.S. temperature graph and a recent one. You can see how they took 1934 from hottest to cooler than 1998 over here. See how they reversed the trend from cooling to warming. But the data tampering is a completely different story. Let's look at some of the things that were going on in 1934. February 3rd, 1934, world's heating up. Ice dissolving at poles. Sea level will rise 40 feet. Now wait a minute. The New Green Deal was supposed to stop sea level rise, not make it rise 40 feet. That doesn't sound like a very good plan. During the 1930s, China was having their 1,800th major famine since the year 108 BC. What this tells us is that when CO2 was low, people were starving to death by tens of millions, year after year. In the 2 years famine of 1877 and 1878, it's estimated that 9,500,000 people starved to death. So many millions died in the famines of 1887, 1889, 1911, and 1916 that enumeration was little better than a guess. In 1920, famine took a toll an estimated of 8 million people. I'm not sure that low CO2 is such a good thing after all. Plants need carbon dioxide to grow, and in fact greenhouses pump up the levels of carbon dioxide in order to make the plants grow faster. One of the reasons why we're having fewer and fewer famines now is because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and our crops are growing better than ever. Meanwhile, in 1934, cold, heat, drought, and flood set new marks. Whole world in freak weather year of 1934. Unprecedented extremes recorded in every corner of the earth. There was a worldwide drought in 1934. The chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau said, "There's something wrong with the weather, and no one knows why." He said, "What is wrong with the world's weather?" is a question I've been asked many times in the last few weeks. It's much simpler to describe what's happening than to try to tell why, for the truth is that no one knows. June 4th, 1934, worldwide drought, farmers' ruinous losses, almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. So the weather was bad and people were resorting to superstition, just like the Democrats are now. Drought in England. England has just experienced the worst drought in nearly 100 years in 1934. The Manchester Guardian, Saturday, May 12, 1934. New York darkened by vast dust cloud. Freak weather in the United States. Heat wave and drought hit the farmers. High temperatures in Britain. The May heat wave of 1934 was by far the worst May heat wave in U.S. history. And it wasn't just in the northern hemisphere. January of 1934 brought massive heat waves and bushfires to Australia. Almost the entire United States was in an extreme drought that year. This is the map from NOAA showing the drought. You see that just about everywhere was an extreme or severe drought. This was completely unprecedented. The drought was so bad that millions of farmers fled the Midwest and moved to California. John Steinbeck wrote about this in The Grapes of Wrath. I'm guessing that Representative Cortez's teachers in high school didn't teach her about Steinbeck. This low CO2 time was a terrible time for people, and there was no social justice. Now let's go look at 1935, which was also an amazing year. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 was the most intense hurricane in U.S. history. The 200-mile-an-hour winds from that hurricane blew this train in the Florida Keys 90 feet off the tracks. It was a rescue train going to pick up veterans at the VA hospital. Hundreds of veterans died in that storm. 1935 also brought the worst dust storms in U.S. history. This was a massive one in Texas in April of 1935. And a few weeks later in 1935, Texas was hit by the world's record rainfall. 22 inches of rain in less than 3 hours at Woodward Ranch. And a few hours earlier, several locations in Colorado were hit with nearly as much rainfall. So 1935 brought record hurricane, record dust storms, and record rainfall. I'm not so sure this low CO2 is such a good idea. Now let's look at 1936, which was actually the most extreme year in U.S. history. The winter of 1936 was the coldest on record in the United States. And incredibly, the summer of 1936 was the hottest on record in the United States. This is the graph of the summer average maximum temperature since 1895 in the United States. See, 1936 up here was really hot, an average of 89 degrees, about 7 degrees warmer than recent years. You can also see how summer temperatures have been declining in the United States since the 19th century, as CO2 has increased. This graph is the number of all-time record temperatures set or tied at all U.S. historical climatology network stations. Look at 1936, way above all other years. And now let's look at the right side of this graph. You can see that we hardly ever set or tie record temperatures anymore. As CO2 has increased, the number of record temperatures has decreased. The heat waves of 1936 were incredible. North Dakota was 121 degrees. South Dakota, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas were 120 degrees. Wisconsin was 114 degrees. New Jersey was 110 degrees. These sort of temperatures are incomprehensible now, and they killed thousands and thousands of people. I wonder why 29-year-old Representative Cortez doesn't remember the summer of 1936. It was reported right in her hometown paper of the New York Times. Crop crisis worse, heat rising to 119 degrees. 31 cities are over 100 degrees. Illinois highways blowing up in the heat. And something else Representative Cortez doesn't remember from 1936 is that March brought some of the worst floods in U.S. history. This was Pittsburgh on St. Patrick's Day 1936. The water was 10 feet deep in downtown Pittsburgh. My grandfather was in a business meeting in Pittsburgh that day, had to be evacuated from downtown by boat. March 20, 1936, all eastern America under floodwaters. Terrible dust storm rages in west. President signs appeal as capital flooded. 100 cities in 14 states affected. And a few weeks after the flooding, one of the worst tornado outbreaks in U.S. history hit the South. Hundreds of people died. So 1936 brought record cold, record heat, record floods, and deadly record tornadoes in April, just a couple weeks after the flooding. Tornado areas burying dead, 201 in Mississippi and 183 in Georgia, 33 missing. I don't know about you, but this low CO2 social justice doesn't necessarily seem like all that great a thing. Now let's go ahead to 1937, which brought the worst flooding on record to the Ohio River. Look at this horse up in a tree weeks after the flood ended. The flood crest on the Ohio River in 1937 was more than 80 feet deep. I'm just going to flash through some of the pictures which were taken back then. This is the National Weather Service poster about that flood. At Louisville, the crest was 85 feet, which was more than 10 feet higher than their previous record in 1945. Cincinnati was 80 feet, which was also 10 feet higher than the record of 1884. Evansville was 53 feet, which was 5 feet higher than their previous record of 1884. It's difficult to have social justice when you're under 85 feet of water. Now let's go ahead one more year to 1938. This was the Great New England Hurricane. Providence, Rhode Island submerged. New York got extremely lucky because this storm went just east of the city. But a lot of other cities in the Northeast were ravaged by it. Let's look at some of the pictures. Congressional Democrats have this idea that they can stop sea level rise and end extreme weather by taking away your car, but there's no basis in history or science for believing that. In fact, as I've just shown you, there's plenty of evidence that past weather in the United States was much more extreme than our current weather is. And as Mark Twain said, imagine you're an idiot, now imagine you're a member of Congress. But I repeat myself. The U.S. has been experiencing record cold this winter. Illinois set their all-time record low temperature. Hawaii set their all-time record low temperature. A couple days ago, Flagstaff, Arizona set their one-day snowfall record. We need our fossil fuels to stay alive. We need our automobiles. What the Democrats are doing is just mindless superstition, and it's dangerous, and we need to stop them. Regardless of what you believe about the relationship between carbon dioxide, climate, and extreme weather, the simple fact of the matter is that China produces a lot more carbon dioxide than the United States. And between them and India, they're building more than 1,000 new coal-fired power plants, which means that anything the United States does is nearly irrelevant. The United States could disappear off the face of the earth and would have very little impact on atmospheric CO2 levels. Perhaps making the U.S. disappear is exactly what the backers of the Green New Deal want. One of the things we need to find out who is really behind this deal. It certainly wasn't thought up by Representative Cortez. She's just their mouthpiece. We need some serious investigations in Congress of what's going on with this. This is a very dangerous plan. It serves no purpose and threatens the very fabric of our society. Without fossil fuels, millions of Americans would have frozen to death this winter. And we're completely dependent on fossil fuels for our communications, transportation, food infrastructure, and just about everything else in our lives. We can't live without it. Bill Gates articulated what's wrong with the delusions about green energy. He said, "Solar is only during the day, and solar only works best in places where it's warm. There's no battery technology that's even close to allowing us to take all of our energy from renewables and be able to use battery storage in order to deal with not only the 24-hour cycle, but also with long periods of time when it's cloudy and you don't have sun and you don't have wind. Power is about reliability. We need to get something that works reliably." A very important quote from Bill Gates, who knows quite a bit about technology. Representative Cortez comes from a generation which has never had to do without food, without water, without heat, without light, without communication. They can barely deal with a weak phone signal and have absolutely no idea what sort of hell they're unleashing on themselves with this Green New Deal. The Green New Deal needs a hard stop, and Republicans need to get serious about putting an end to this sort of madness. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.